right. Welcome in, everyone. Excited to have you all here today. Feel free to drop in the chat where you are listening in from. I am the lone rally team member based up here in Canada. But yeah, I love to always see where folks are based. Jake, where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Seattle.
Love it. We have anyone else on the West Coast? Definitely let us know. We'll give maybe a minute or two for some more folks to trickle in. Oh my gosh, Toronto.
Oh, Vancouver
Love to see
Island.
it. Oh my gosh, wow, these Canadians. Oh, amazing. So excited to see that. That's awesome. Yeah, while we wait, for those of you who maybe are new to our AMAs, my name is Sydney. I'm our senior product marketing manager on the Rally team. And yeah, super excited to be chatting with Jake today, who is the author of Stop Wasting Research. I think everyone who registered knows about this book because everyone's getting a 20% off discount code, which is super exciting. So we'll definitely be sharing that. But yeah, Jake, maybe I'll pass it over to you just to give us a brief intro on yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for joining. So a little bit about me. I got started in research in .com and kind of quickly became a generalist across a variety of roles: design, business analysis, what we would see as product management today, setting roadmaps across new product concepts. And I did consulting for years before deciding to go in-house. And when you going into sort of big tech, you have to choose one of the roles. There's not many generalist roles. So I went back to my roots in UX research. And I've always had this focus across my career on getting the most out of what's already known before trying going off and learning anything new. So whether that was finding existing research in an organization or drawing upon research in industry or academia. And I really turned that into a focus at a role at Amazon, and spent 6 years running different insight initiatives, first as a principal researcher, then as a principal product manager, working with an amazing community of researchers. And since then, I've focused on, really learning from all the amazing things going on in industry in the last years around knowledge management and doing advising. I spent a couple of years on the Research Ops Community Board. Some folks may know me from posting articles in that Slack. And what brings me to today is, spending some time working with the amazing team at Rosenfeld Media to put together this book called Stop Wasting Research, Maximize the Product Impact of Your Organization's Customer Insights, which is about bringing together all sorts of existing research, trying to get more done with it, and planning. All researchers often talk about wanting to have more strategic impact. How can we use existing research to do those sorts of things?
Amazing. Thank you, Jake. And yeah, we're going to definitely get into some of the topics of your book. So, super excited for our conversation today. And yeah, you have obviously a very extensive background in supporting a multitude of different teams with getting more out of their research and, improving their research strategy and their insight strategy. So, yes, super excited to dive into how teams can unlock more value from research that they've already done, and why maybe even doing less research could lead to more impact in terms of focusing on those insights, and how that follow through and reusable insights are, changing the game for research and research operations and product leaders. So yeah, super excited to chat with Jake today. As we go through our conversation, please feel free to drop questions for Jake in the chat. And then around sort of the 30-minute or 45-minute mark, we will definitely be answering some questions from everyone. So Jake, maybe can you tell us a little bit about what really inspired you or motivated you to write this book?
Well, researchers are having amazing impacts in industry today, all sorts of researchers working in applied settings in tech. And you don't write a book called Stop Wasting Research unless you really value research, right? And so, we walk away from studies with the wins from that study. It's advancing products, it's doing great things for organizations and customers, it's advancing researchers' careers. But, if you take a minute to look back at what's been learned, as I've had the opportunity to do analyzing big bodies of research, you find that there's just amazing insights that didn't make the cut. And then the question becomes, what do we do with these? And so I started with this emphasis on research repositories, certainly was working in that space before the research ops community was developed, uh, and didn't have the language for it, and was very happy when so many folks in the industry have been sharing their ideas and product offerings and all sorts of interesting things in this space. But, I found that so much of the work around this and the piece that is missing is culture change and activities around information. If knowledge management covers everything from, yes, consolidating knowledge in useful ways, but also figuring out ways to communicate it, activate it, put it to use in the times and decisions where it could be useful. I feel like that last half of the knowledge management equation was underrepresented. And I wrote an article on Medium during sort of a COVID era detour called "Stop or Fighting Insight Waste with Research Repositories," and that framing really connected with people. It's not just about a catalog of existing content. There's wasted wealth here that we could be getting more value out of in product development. And I feel like some folks in the industry that I've talked to are well on their way to doing this. But as an industry at large, we have a long way to go in this space, and I'm hoping the book will help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everyone's excited to get their hands on it. Yeah, and just continue to learn more after our conversation today. Um, yeah, I think it's super interesting because I think often, at least on my side, I've heard from a lot of researchers and PMs and designers that when you have an idea for a study or research that needs to be run, the first thought is like, let me put together a plan, and not necessarily let me look at what's already been done. And I think some organizations sometimes even struggle with like, where do I even look? Like, how do
Mhm,
I get started? And
mhm.
so, yeah, obviously, we know in your book that you write that a lot of research doesn't maybe even get the chance to be used. Why do you think that is so common in orgs today?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think you can break it down into a couple of parts. There's sort of in the study process and then after the study process. And I really focus on the latter in Stop Wasting Research, but let's focus on the former. So, so much of the discussion about research and industry is about optimizing the study. It's about some amazing method, here's how to, and here's how to frame your insights and deliver them, and all these things. So many influencers and books kind of helping people enhance their craft, and it's a constant area of optimization. But even still, if you target your questions very carefully for a particular group of stakeholders and you conduct world-class research and narrow in, there's still a remainder. Folks can't, even if the study was relatively narrow, customers in the real world and systems are surprising. We learn all sorts of things that teams aren't ready to deal with. And oftentimes researchers just inherently learn much more than a team can digest in a particular moment while they're implementing things, vaguely thinking about what's next. But if we brought those insights back later at the right time, we might be able to make more progress. That, and a lot of insights in this fragmented world where there's so many squads in an organization, we're still kind of running research as if it's very relational, where we have to be deeply connected with stakeholders, when really we can't be as organizations scale. And how do we kind of scale out that influence in individual studies? How can we not just learn for the folks that we're talking to directly, but for the organization at large and other folks that might get value out of insights? So that's on the study optimization side. And just quickly on the other side, in Stop Wasting Research, I organize it around three root causes. You mentioned findability, right? So there's more we could do to prepare our research for use over the long haul. Clearly, kind of disparate storage of random reports isn't really doing it for folks. A lot of folks have recognized this problem and are starting to do something for it, but we can prepare in ways that enable the impacts we want to see. Motivation is another reason, another root cause. Folks see insights as optional inputs once, you're out of that study process, and we can work to change that. And then if you've really prepared your research to be useful over the long haul, and people are starting to see the value in using existing research and they want to, they're motivated, you can still lose on the third root cause, which is integration, which is, having the right touch points with insights. It's not just, at the end of a study. It's not just, in one big report out or share outs, a variety of things that people are doing today. How can we bring insights back to the right people at the right time and actually inject them into the work that we want to influence. And so research systems and new operations can enable us to do that.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I really like that in your book and in our conversation today, sort of break that down in a very easy to understand way. I think it's also really interesting because, yeah, when you think about sort of that second half after study optimization about um, what happens after the research is done, what I'm hearing and what it's sounding like is like really you can start to think about that at the very beginning. Like, how do you prepare your research? What are some of those like tactical frameworks so that research can be used for the long haul, across that lifespan of the entire cycle.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, super interesting, and yeah, I'm hoping that you'll be able to share some helpful hints with us today. But maybe can you, just so that we can sort of understand like the full impact of this, can you share a story where valuable insights were maybe overlooked but then came back to influence decisions later on?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, sort of across my career, this has always been my bias, but I've always been at sort of individual level or working with a particular team. And as a consultant, like pulling together what those known and influencing a small set of decisions. What this book about is thinking beyond the individualistic research work or a team and thinking at organizational scale. And the first time I had the opportunity to do that was at Amazon and pulling together years of existing research and finding all sorts of gold that these amazing researchers had developed and all of a sudden synthesizing research that svp is that manages 200,000 people is asking me what should I be thinking about from existing learning, or where I really felt like we were on to something is when insights that had been overlooked but built up evidence over time and we pulled it together, that teams referenced them in A/B experiments and had big wins, and suddenly we're asking what else do you have, wanting as an input to their product planning. But I mean, those were formative experiences, but this has been years since then, and I've seen and talked to teams using existing insights in all sorts of ways, whether it's taking that ethnography from 3 years ago and breaking it out into useful chunks for the new jobs to be done framework, and framing upcoming goals, or a variety of different ways. I think anybody that has invested in research repositories and had any success has some story about an existing insight kind of coming out of the recycling bin and making an impact. The question is, how can we scale that up?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Scale that up, and I think like at least something that you mentioned earlier is kind of around that communication piece,
Mhm.
and figuring out how do you communicate at that organizational scale, not only where that research lives, but how do I access it? How do I effectively utilize it across
Yes.
the entire company? Which I think is also a big challenge. What do you think, just so for folks that are listening, maybe what are some of the early warning signs that research is going unused?
It's an interesting question because it's a problem that a lot of folks don't recognize given the current state of the industry and what we expect for accountability from research. We count our wins from a study. And like I said, they're advancing all sorts of things. So you really have to take stock and look back and say, okay, that study that everybody raves about, what didn't we act on? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, and then if you look at that across a number of high-end valuable studies that have a lot to say about where a product could be going, you start to really see it. I think the other place that people start to see it is, a lot of teams are starting to ask for more accountability at the study level and listing out their insights and saying, hey, what are you doing about this? There's always been some teams that have done that, but I've heard more about insight tracking in the current environment where researchers are asked to demonstrate their impact a lot. And you can start to see sort of a remainder there of, what's having some impact, but could having much more. But I think where you really start to notice it is when you start to take stock of what your organization already has, even if it's early days, and start thinking about where that might go next. And then you start to get a feel for the problem, and you can start talking to others about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's super interesting. I wanted to pull up, before we move on to the next question, there is one from Rosanna in the audience here. Is there a limit on how far back we can get from existing research? Curious what you think about this one.
Yeah, it's a The age of research is the most common question when you're doing activities like this. And I've seen real value from 5-year-old insights. Things in the tech industry, there's such a bias against that idea, but customer needs often don't change very much. We could use our judgment and look to say, this market has moved. We're targeting a different customer. Our product has changed. We can absolutely rule out tons of things using judgment, but throwing everything away because of its age doesn't make sense. That being said, you can't. So much of knowledge management is about scoping and prioritization. You may say we're only going to look 2 years back, and then all of the ethnographic studies or all these kind of deeper studies for 5 years or 3 years or something. You got to relentlessly scope your efforts, but age alone does not discount an insight, especially in user research where we're studying people.
Yeah, totally. And it's super interesting to hear you say that, yeah, exactly what you just said. You can't discount an insight based on its age, and that you can still get value from, 5-year-old insights. And I think, what you said about customer needs not changing very much, I think that's definitely maybe even like a myth in the tech industry, is
Absolutely.
that, we assume, okay, I did this study, a few weeks have gone by, or a few months, and, maybe what I learned in this study isn't relevant anymore. When really, you have the experience at, some of the world's biggest companies like Amazon, where you're looking at that, years and years of insights that are still relevant. So I think that's a really, really interesting takeaway. And Jake, what do you think are some of the hidden costs
Mm.
of this pattern of not using research for like the long haul?
Well, there's always the basis of we're placing all sorts of bets in this very distributed world of kind of micro planning towards objectives. uh, Leaders are saying, I think this is important and I'm going to experiment in this direction towards it. Very contemporary mindset. And where it used to be a handful of leaders, now it's even in a medium sized organization, it's a staggering number of leaders for researchers to try and influence. That fragmentation is only increasing over time. So if the question is, what are they placing their bet based on? And people place their bets based on all sorts of things. What researchers are trying to do is inform those bets. And so how can we increase the ratio of research-based planning? And why would we do that? For all the reasons that people are already getting value out of research. It's helping them refine, the things that would be useful for customers. It's helping them not go after features that wouldn't be useful. It's helping them seize opportunities that can lift those metrics. All the things that researchers are already providing value in, we could be capitalizing on more research and getting more of that value. And in some organizations, in some of those higher end scenarios where you're not really influencing earlier stages of the planning process, you're just at the end of the process. It's a way to sort of reach backward in the flow and tie more research in. So all those things that researchers are already doing, we just can get more value out of it by looking at our existing research.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like that existing research and the studies that have already been done is like that investment.
Mhm.
And how do you get the most out of that investments that has been made in terms of resources, researcher time, energy, even like down to financial investments
Yeah, I love
for
that. If I could
recruitment.
just build on that is,
Yeah.
the quote that people resonated with the most when reviewing drafts of my book is, how much would a competitor pay to know what your organization is ignoring or has forgotten? These are business assets, and we're not treating them like it.
Yeah, super interesting. That is such a great point. Um, Yeah, great call out. And so, yes, we know that your take is that teams should be investing more in that follow through, and maybe even, yeah, focusing on that more so than like doing even more research. Um, I'm curious how you see sort of like um, the individuals at a company adjacent to research, so like research ops, product management, maybe like design ops. How do you see those kinds of different departments supporting that?
Well, There's always been a spread of ideas in the population of researchers of, is it my job just to deliver insights, or is it my job to, advocate for what's been learned because I'm working in industry and this is a product I'm trying to influence. I've always leaned into the latter, and I'm trying to increase the distribution in that direction with this book, by pointing things out that could be useful. And to your question about, how do adjacent roles fit into that? Well, research ops in particular, or other kinds of operations in some organizations, it might be product ops, can take uh, what are so much of research work is very individualistic. It's my study, my stakeholders, my learning. A lot of what we're doing with research repositories and activating research knowledge is more collective. And so, how can we build the operational layer on top of that that makes a lot of things easier for researchers, so they want to contribute to these kind of efforts because they get value out of it? They're seeing new impacts without having to, be directly involved, or leaders are seeing their insights that they would have connected otherwise with and are reaching out. So there's all sorts of benefits researchers can get that operations can kind of say, this is really, for all the things operations does, this is really hard for individuals to do. We clearly can add a layer of infrastructure on top of this, a platform on top of it. So that's one way. And I think the other audience you alluded to was sort of the the insight seeking half, or the insight consumer half. And you talked earlier about, teaching people how to use research. What are our expectations around using research? And so, there's a ton of ideas in the book about that, where if you're directly involved in a study, you have a relationship and you're kind of having a conversation about it oftentimes. And this ideal case that we often talk about as researchers, right? If you really drill in, oftentimes it's not the reality, but we still kind of treat it like it is. But, as we're trying to extend out from there and we're trying to get more insights used and scale that up, how do we want people to do that? And how can we make it easier by kind of pushing things to people instead of expecting people to show up? And we want to tell them how we want research to be cited, and what good research use looks like, and we can celebrate it and kind of create a flywheel that researchers get more motivated to contribute to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, in addition to sort of like the um, business benefit of, as we've talked about, like making sure you get the most out of that research investment, it also is sounding like this is another way to like elevate the researcher role and maybe pull
Mhm.
researchers into more of that strategic
Mhm.
position, and even further like prove the impact of research, where you can utilizing those insights across the company to make decisions. So yeah, I think it even like at the end of the day is a way to pull researchers into that more strategic like level of their career, which I think is just another benefit.
That's my hope.
Love it. Awesome. So Jake, have you seen teams that are maybe like more focused on doing more research, study after study? Have you seen teams successfully rebalance that, toward reuse and follow through? And what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's the small scale step. Like if we picture a smaller group of researchers in an organization, you know, it could be about one person experimenting with something and the others seeing the value in it and kind of growing it out, or it can be a sort of a research leader wanting to put more emphasis on it. But it starts often, or one way to start, and there's a lot of patterns that I've seen, is to build it into studies and study workflow and extending study timeframes without asking permission, right? There's so much that researchers, we have to balance this sort of service mindset and, doing what we think is right for the situation that the organization is in. We're doing what's right for the customers and for the business. And, we can think about how to change our own studies to increase the amount of follow through, to increase the amount of research use, and not really ask permission for it, and just started to change the norm around it over time. I think that that's one way. Another early step way, thinking of sort of smaller teams before they have sort of these infrastructures of operations around this stuff, is to say, you know, project based. instead of conducting that next study, I hear these upcoming uncertainties in leadership. I hear these research questions, and we're going to focus on reusing existing insights for that before we have fancy tooling, before we have some big initiative around this. We're going to show the value, because nothing shows the value of existing research more than taking something that leaders are really concerned about and bringing a bunch of existing work to bear on it. And then suddenly, as soon as you've done that, one of the biggest questions you'll get is, what do we already know about? And not in sort of if you don't answer this in 5 minutes, I'm going to go somewhere else, but like with genuine interest. So a lot of ideas in the book in that space. There's just a couple.
Yeah, super interesting. So it's sounding like, well, I think the first thing that's really important is to be able to start small and, not have
Mhm.
this be an overwhelming project, but really starting small and then also speaking the same language as stakeholders and really tying the work that you're doing back to the things that they care about.
Absolutely.
And yeah, totally agree. I think that's, yeah, a really, I mean, it's so easy to talk about it and it's sort of hard to actually do. But yeah, makes total sense. So I'm curious, earlier on in our discussion, you sort of talked about, the findability stage of a project and preparing your research for the long haul before you even start. So I'm curious if you have any takeaways for us on maybe some tactical ways to start to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first stage I recommend, it's the second chapter of the book, and I have sort of a process in there that's a little bit heavier weight, but you can take the idea and do a lighter weight version. It's just really taking stock of what you have. A lot of great thinking in this space and action in this space starts with just a spreadsheet, right? Before you have the fancy thing, you explore the simple ways of doing things in order to understand the requirements for what you might actually be looking for, instead of just going and grabbing some fancy tool with big marketing claims. And taking stock by saying, in the last 2 years, or to that question, setting some frame and pulling together a research, not just from UX researchers, but in the book I take a big tent definition of research and say, how can we pull together all kinds of customer investigation that researchers would recognize as research, whether that's market research or, data science or various roles in an organization, and pull together what's known so that you can start to think about, what do we know across our silos? You know, it's a when you ask for lightweight, that's a bit of a lift, right? But it enables even if it's just a snapshot, it's incomplete, all those things. It enables all sorts of things. Um, Another thing that you can do that's much more lightweight is look for opportunities to present the work of other researchers into your silo. So start to build goodwill. There's so much of this is about communicating and building, community across different researchers, that if you see value in someone else's work, have them present, create a venue where researchers can share their top insights, regardless of their silo. Figure out ways to kind of start connecting into existing study processes and finding new audiences so that folks can get more value. There are many ways in the book for breaking down silos, but those are just a couple. One a little bit heavier lift in taking an inventory, because I think that so much starts from an inventory, and then increasing each other's input by just finding more audiences for each other and building goodwill that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sounding like a lot of like relationship building between researchers, between, we talked a little bit about PMs and designers and sort of like cross-functional departments. And I think that's really amazing and sort of like applicable to many different departments within an org. Is if
Mhm.
you see value in the work that another researcher has done, share that. I think,
Mhm.
yeah, it's another way to also sort of like build trust and
Mhm.
allies within the company as a whole. So I think there's like many benefits with that. I'm curious, how do you or how would you encourage teams to like share research more openly, like we've talked about, without, I guess, overwhelming other departments or people with that information?
I really value that question, and I have a sidebar in the book about, aren't we doing too much of this, right? And I think if you kind of imagine all of the sharing that individual investigators are doing and teams are doing, and just suddenly expanding the audience massively, of course it would be too much. Wouldn't be targeted, all those sorts of things. There are smart ways to do this, and we need to think of it as sort of internal marketing, and we need to think of it programmatically. I do think it's a real operational topic. Rodrigo Delsen from the Cha Cha Club just released an article about automations and was talking about automated dissemination of findings. I think we can kind of, as systems designers and thinkers in this space, look at our organization, look at who we want to know different kinds of insights, and tailor the communications for that, whether it's the snackable size in one space, the summary report in the other. I have a bunch of different reporting ideas in the book. I think particularly once you start to kind of break reports, all new research, consolidating that is just a big obvious win for a community, and it makes people want to contribute to this. It's a club you want to join, you want to onboard, because your research can be seen by more folks, and it's sort of a general here's what's new kind of way. Where it gets much harder is when you're talking about specific insights and specific problems, and you have to be smart about how to route those. Every culture is different. I've got a bunch of patterns in the book. No one's going to use them all. They're going to come up with other ideas within the themes. But it's a plan not to overwhelm, but to get the impacts you want. Working backwards from what do we want from that communication, and letting that steer it rather than just kind of over blasting, which I think is very possible with these tools.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like you're saying, speaking the language of the folks that you're communicating with. I think, if you're going to send a 40-page report to a PM, for example, they might not read the whole thing. But if you're able to communicate the findings in a way that's like exciting to them, and maybe they learn something new, I think it is, I think it just goes that much further. And I think another point that you made is about sort of like, you mentioned internal marketing, but I think it's also like marketing like yourself in a way, and marketing the work that you've done and that your colleagues have done, and sort of bringing that attention, back to all of the energy that you've put in. And I think, I think it's like necessary. I don't think we do that enough.
People can't care about things they don't know about. A lot of research work cuts off midway in the org chart. And yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, the other thing I'm thinking about is, I think like as researchers, we're like closest to the customer in a lot of ways. And I think knowing off the top of your head, what customers are thinking, what they have on their mind, whether it's from like last week or years ago, and to be able to communicate that voice to stakeholders all the way up to, potentially like C-suite, if it's something that they care about, is like a huge value add to the business overall.
Absolutely.
Amazing. All right. So the other thing that you have, in your book, when you talk about insights and findability, insight summaries as being sort of one of the most valuable research tools, can you share a little bit about what do you mean by that, and maybe give us some examples if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. If reports are sort of time-bound units or whatever outputs of a study, and we want to work more collaboratively and we want to make stronger cases for insights, how do we do that? And the atomic research movement, Thomas Sharon and Daniel Pidcock and all the tools that have followed in the subsequent years have shown us that research is much more plastic than it was originally thought. It's a deck, or it's a document. Those are just communications that come out of a set of content. And for the things that are most important, how do we keep those alive? And how do we keep building on them over time? So an insight summary and an insight summary hub is one of the types of repositories I talk about. It's nothing super novel, right? They talked about insight hubs and the Research Ops repository work years ago. Andrew Warr talks about primers. Other recent publications have talked about distilling individual insights. Different tools do this already, but I wanted to kind of give it a name, an insight summary, and kind of call it what I think is useful in it. It's a very crisp insight title. It's the headline, that you would want to show up in different planning spaces that is hyperlinked. So this plan is motivated by this insight. I can read it and double click on it and see more about it. And what the more is content that's built up from across studies that gives me context and evidence for supporting that insight. Or if there's any conflicting research, are in there as well. And, you can get really fancy from there, but these start as, and, you could link out into the underlying reports. You could think of it as a pyramid. You start with that insight title and you have a destination, sort of a one-stop shop for that insight, and it can link out to a bunch of things. And this can start as, Confluence pages, Google Docs, Notion, whatever is in your, to the point of starting simple to understand what your requirements are and the thinking of fancy tools later. The goal of this is to break research down into units. To your point about that busy PM, they could look at that insight title, and I've reviewed thousands of insights with PMs at the title level, and they can just agree with a lot of them if they're in the planning mindset. Or they can be curious or have skeptical, and then they can dig into the evidence and get further. So it's sort of a pyramid. And what these enable us to do is all sorts of new reporting, think about all sorts of new kinds of accountability, but we can't do it for every insight. I've made that mistake in the past. This is really about investing effort to get the ROI from research work, where it's the underutilized insights that we think could be making a big difference. And I have a chapter in the book called Clarify What Matters Most, to kind of hone in on prioritization topics, not at the study level, but across studies.
Yeah, interesting. I really like how you're mentioning, building up content from across studies, and to the point that you made earlier about like pulling from studies that colleagues have done, or, past research that exists. I think that goes to show, number one, if folks are interested in diving deeper, they can very easily with everything being hyperlinked. That's sort of like a very tactical thing that is like easy to do,
Mhm.
but also just to make everything, I guess it sort of like validates that insight, that it's like, look, it's not just this like one user or this one study that said this. Here's like all the evidence that you can sort of build into that insight summary.
Mhm.
Yeah, super, super interesting. So I'm curious, how have you historically balanced the need for like concise summaries? Like we talked about that PM, maybe just seeing the title and being like, "Yep, makes sense," and like providing the nuance that researchers, we want to preserve.
Well, I'll I'll just challenge this researcher nuance idea. There's what researchers want. They always want to show up with a feast at the table when, and folks may just want a snack, right? And really, you got to focus back not just on what you want as a researcher, but what are the outcomes you're trying to drive. And, you know, sometimes if someone's reading an insight title, it could have 10 studies underneath it that were extremely difficult to conduct, and all the evidence, and, to make an extreme case, right? Uh, and they don't even click to look. They just buy the problem and move ahead. That's impact, right? You know that it's based on something. You know that there was rigor that went into it. That's not the normal case. The normal case is that people kind of dig in and look around. And because it's a pyramid, where you start with the title, ideally linked into a planning or design document or roadmap specification. I have a bunch of ideas for whatever those might be in your organization in the book. And they kind of drill down from there. The nuance that you have in your own communications should be linked from this space. Your presentation, your documents. So it's not, yes, it can be line items in a table. That feels like a loss. As a researcher, I can recognize that. I've been that person. I've held those opinions. But as a person who was tasked with getting a lot more value out of research, I've become much more okay with it over time, as long as it's accessible.
Yep, totally. Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about sort of like researchers considering what outcomes are you trying to drive, and sort of tying everything back to, the original impact that you're trying to have. That, as we talked about earlier, ideally that's tied back to business outcomes or business goals, or maybe, something that a stakeholder or leadership cares deeply about so that they pay attention.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think that sort of like pyramid structure that you have talked about today, and have in a lot more detail in the book. It's, I think, a quick way, well, not necessarily quick, but it's a really powerful way to prove your impact, because instead of people, asking, seeing an insight and being like, where'd you see that? Or, what research was done, basically wanting the proof, you have that up front and people can kind of dive as deep as they want. And yeah, I really love what Scott put in the chat here. Focus on value, not artifacts. I really love that. I think it's easy to get caught up in the weeds and the process and the structure, making things look beautiful, when I think, yeah, really the value is what's important. So sort of on that note, can you share a bit about what role tooling and structure play in making research findable later on?
Mm. Yeah, if you're starting from those outcomes that you want to change in how planning works in your organization and working backwards from there, you can really hone in how tooling can add value. And if you experiment with some low tech ways of doing things as a community, you can start to define the requirements that are important. But in the book, I have a chapter called Launch Knowledge Consolidating Tools. It's not the first one, it's well into the book, because I think there's a lot of things that people can do before, even though in the industry we often say, what tool do you use? As if the tool is going to solve this problem, when it's really about culture change enabled by information. Uh, you know, I talk about report libraries where we consolidate our outputs. There's all sorts of amazing UX tools that are supporting workflow all the way through to libraries. But if you want to integrate data science, even quant UX, CS, different kinds of research learning into the same space, reports are the common output. That serves as a location to do synthesis, to point folks to under a common umbrella, of this initiative. But it's not the end of the story. And we talked about insight hubs, insight summaries. I talk about, a separate tool can be in the same one, or often, can be something separate for insight summaries, where we take the top insights and pull them together. And for findability within that, I talk about different kinds of metadata. In the conversation about AI, a lot of folks say, oh, tagging's dead or metadata's dead. I think if you want to get things done with research, it's definitely not. If you're just interested in discovering what's in your organization and having it be different every time, I don't think that's still going to stop wasting research personally, maybe a little bit, but not to the degree that we need in the industry. So very sparing metadata, as little as you can, describing different pieces of research, of course, but then for findability, I have different ideas from sort of an insider perspective, what fitting your organization, and an outsider perspective, looking at customers. And the most important metadata, because we're talking about getting things done with insights, is an owning team who might do something with an insight. And I don't think any technology is going to make the value of that decreased. Sure, it could suggest it, but we still need to organize research to get things done.
Yeah, totally. And something I've heard in the product marketing industry as well, but I think it's sort of applicable here, is that tools are only as good as the training, the onboarding, the buy-in across the team. But I think for that to also be successful, as you mentioned, the culture of the business and the team, has to be open to it, and being able to utilize that tool so that you get the most value, out of that as well. So I'm curious how, or maybe can you share, and I know you sort of mentioned a few ideas, but can you share a few other ways that teams can start to build a culture of that reuse, where it's, not just necessarily spitting out reports?
Yeah, I think I'd go back to thinking about individual researchers and their workflows is if I talked about the study process and the follow through, the thing that we're already doing is the study process. So how can we look to reuse research there? I think the most basic way is to say every study plan should become a report. It should have what we already know in it. And that could start not with a fancy repository. It can start with a chat channel with all of our researchers. And we know it's going to be incomplete. But we're going to ask, do we have any existing research for these three top research questions? Not every one from the study or whatever. But then when we're saying we're planning this study, here's what we've already learned, here's how it refined our questions, and you get value from the start. We always want to talk about speed to insights. That's the fastest, right? And it's not in an ad hoc way, it's still in a sensible research process. The other side is to say that how can we evolve reporting as individual researchers to what we learned from this sample, this method, this particular time frame, into what have we learned about these topics. So yes, the new content is featured, but existing learning is not a footnote, it's in the body. We're trying to turn every research report into a download for the space and for those questions, not just reporting out what's fresh. So there's a couple of ideas, taking it back to the individual researcher workflow, and then operations and things can build it out from there. But
Yeah. Yeah. I really love that you mentioned that. As the study plan start as a report. I think that's a really great way to, number one, identify, the gaps that you need to continue to maybe do more research on, but also to plan for that for the long haul and consider all the research that you've already done. I think that's also a great way to sort of like create that flywheel that you mentioned of ongoing research. It's like, okay, let's look at what we have and what we've learned, maybe identify some of the gaps, to also help to like prove the value of what's been done, but also, make a case for here's what we don't know and here's why we need to, start another study.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, that's a great idea. Amazing. All right. So we have just over 10 minutes left. Please, everyone who is listening, drop your questions for Jake in the chat and we will pull them up. But before we get to any audience questions, I want to ask you one final thing, which, obviously, as we've chatted about today, you've packed a lot of tactical thinking and ideas into your book, Stop Wasting Research. Would you be able to share with us a behind the scenes moment or a learning from writing the book that maybe didn't make it in?
I think the biggest behind the scenes thing that happened was actually early on, where it was how to structure this sort of thinking, what to include in it. Um, and, originally I was trying to think of it very sequentially, where, here's early moves. I talk about a model where you move from a crawl, walk, run to a marathon. And I'd sort of organized it more in that sort of mindset, acknowledging that this is a long term effort. And ended up pivoting it based on input from Lou Rosenfeld to those ideas of root causes of preparation, motivation, and integration, and that alternate organization. I do think that that other framing is useful. And a lot of the questions I get are, what things should we do first? And so we're developing a training that will kind of pivot back to that original table of contents and focus on sort of those early days of crawl and walk. But there's so many things that um, you know, I'm painting a big picture of ideas for research catalysts. And the real question was how to organize it. It's such an interesting challenge.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks for sharing that behind the scenes. We just got a message from Brittany in the chat saying that they can't wait to get their hands on this book. Sounds like a total gem.
Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, I'm super excited for everyone to grab a copy. And yes, thank you so much, Jake, for chatting with me today. Really, really appreciate it. We have some questions that I'm going to pull up in the last few minutes here. And the other thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning of our chat is 3 people will be winning a free copy of Jake's book. So we're going to announce that in the last 5 minutes here too. So this is from Scott, who is interested in thoughts about self-service versus mediated access to research and research insights. So yeah, curious about your thoughts here, Jake.
That's a big topic. Thank you for that question, Scott. There's often a concern about opening up access to research, and of course, some things for governance, legal, privacy, ethics reasons we don't open up access to in some organizations, or certain kinds of raw data stores and things. But when we talk about interpreted research that was been meant to be communicated, even then, what does it mean to open up? Am I going to miss out on conversations around that? So I think at a systems level, opening up, we have to think of how do we do that in a way that enables researchers to be in more of the conversations that they want to be in. So that's a kind of a operational problem. And then, self-service is something that should be possible. My experience is that folks, and people talk about sort of putting a chat bot over a pile of research and expecting it to solve knowledge management. My experience is that people often don't know what to ask, even the refinement and back and forth. They don't, because the researchers have such a nuanced view of what's been learned and what they've learned, that they can kind of direct people in interesting ways. So self-service should be possible. Think about all those internal tools and data sources in an organization. If you just relied on self-service, you're not going to get the outcomes you want out of that. It's just another internal tool, right? So I think the real value of consolidating knowledge in repositories is figuring out new ways to push it, is to find ways to create new kinds of reporting, new kinds of connections, new integration points. So it's the hub that you reach out from, not just thinking of it as going to be some sort of sticky destination. And there's a lot of ideas about that in the book, but just to give a shorter answer there.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jake. I think, I mean, what it's sounding like is almost like you want those insights to be self-serve, but with the right sort of guidelines or guardrails or even like support in place so that folks can still continue to get the most out of those insights. And I think the other thing, at Rally, we work a lot with customers who are decentralizing research and enabling self-serve. And I think it's very, also partially dependent on the culture of the company and,
Absolutely.
how does the company want to scale and how do they want to democratize those insights and sort of that research function. Perfect. All right. We got a few more questions here in the last few minutes. This one is from Aaron. So in enterprise orgs where there are many other teams who are also very close to customers, like success, professional services, support, how does that impact how we adopt the ideas that you've shared today, Jake?
Oh, I love this question. This is, not everybody has this mindset necessarily. A lot of folks I talk to about getting more done with their research, what I'm advising are really just thinking about their stripe of research. So our UX research teams are distributed, and I think the tool sets that have come along in the last few years are kind of just throwing a lot of this data together and allowing people to access it. But, there's folks doing all kinds of research in an organization, and in sort of taking stock of what's being learned in your organization, I think that you can kind of look through and say, are they creating some sort of durable study output, or is this just sort of ad hoc? Are they respecting governance? You could set some bars of who you would want to include and collaborate with, because you just don't want to, you can always triangulate with some other data, but who do you want to bring into your initiative and your community? And, I think in a lot of organizations, you may find that there are several other stripes of investigation that you could start collaborating with. And, having done that, all sorts of amazing things can happen where you're triangulating different kinds of data post hoc, and making much stronger cases for really important problems to solve or really fundamental learnings about customers by bringing those things together. And oftentimes different stripes of research have different mechanisms for getting things done with research. So, customer success may have this way of approaching getting more done. They're connected into voice of customer meetings, or, data science is operating with these kind of leaders. And by kind of leveraging each other's pathways, by starting to pool your research together, think of yourself, yes, as individual workers, but also members of a collective, that is consolidating its knowledge and trying to get more done. You could take advantage of those different pathways to impact. And, in some cases, reach audiences that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you said pathways to impact, and it's a good reminder that I think everyone who works very closely with customers, I mean, everyone within the company are sort of part of that collective and focused on the same goal at the end of the day. So I think being able to leverage the work that those teams are doing. And like you mentioned earlier on, like referencing other research work, maybe there's other like allies you can make on those teams that you could reference the work that they're doing as well. So I think that's really interesting, and is also really helpful to sort of like bridge gaps between those different departments, because I think it's very easy to like fall into a pattern and where those departments start to get very siloed. And I think at the end of the day, I think a lot of folks in these different departments care about the customer, and it's like, how do you get like the most value out of those connections as possible.
And just one other quick thing is, bringing the expertise in research that you bring, you can connect with those other audiences. We talk about democratization and sort of this trying to raise skills around particular types of customer connection and investigation. Uh, That applies to these teams as well. Maybe you see their work at first and you say, oh, I wouldn't want to connect too closely with that, but you can help them sort of raise where they're at, and then you would really value it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Aaron, for that question.
Thank you.
Amazing. Awesome. All right. We have one final question. We will try to keep this one quick because, yes, we need to announce our winners. So this question is, what are the best ways to market research with a broader audience? And I know that, Jake, you talked about insight summaries today. I think that's a really interesting piece. But curious if you have any other quick takes on this.
When you think about a broad audience, why do people connect with research? They want to find things that are applicable to their own specific work, but there's also more general interest in customer connection. And so new research is the ultimate filter for a very broad audience. And you can kind of really drive a lot of interest in what researchers are doing in your campaign to get more done with research by figuring out ways to more, to consolidate new research and share it out to a bigger and bigger audience where it makes sense and is permissible in your organization. And so I think that as a filter can be really useful. And it's about leveraging the communication channels that make sense in your org. In some places it's a big email report, and other places it's taking a goal around it and tying into goal-based reporting, whatever is going to get the kind of interest that you're hoping to see. And then from there, what does broader mean? Broader, that's the broadest. And then you can kind of say, there are some types of insights that we want to have, hit certain parts of the organization. And you can think about that again, back to planning, and say, how can we kind of group those things together and find the right channel for it? We're short on time, so I'll stop there, but I love this question.
Amazing. Thank you, Jake. And yes, hope that was helpful. I think, this hour flew by. I think we could continue chatting about this stuff for days. But yes, that was, a really, really fun conversation. Lots of really good stuff to talk about. And super excited for, the launch of your book back in June, I guess it was. And excited for everyone to grab a copy if you're interested. So I want to flash up the code that you can use to get 20% off of Jake's book. So feel free to grab a screenshot of this, but we'll also be sharing it in a follow-up email after our chat today. And we'll also share the URL where you can grab Jake's book from. And we've also randomly selected 3 members of the audience today to win a free copy of Stop Wasting Research. So I will pull up their names right now. Exciting. We have Shane, Jessica, and Josh. So congrats to you 3. I will be in touch to get you your free copy of Jake's book, Stop Wasting Research. And other than that, we are right on time. So thank you everyone for joining in to our call today. That was a really, really fun conversation. And thank you so much, Jake, for being part of this.
Thanks so much for having me and everyone for attending.
Awesome. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.